Welcome back to the Global Landscapes Forum 2019 here in very sunny Bonn. And I'm here with Anne Larson from C4, who's a scientist and team leader for equal opportunities, gender, tenure, and justice. Thank you for joining us. You're also an expert on forestry and landscape governance and policy, and also represents C4 in the Rights and Resources Initiatives, an NGO focusing on land, forest rights, and indigenous people and local communities. Got that right? Thank you for joining us.
Thank you.
Thank you. So why don't we talk about your research in terms of rights, like land tenure? What are your most important findings recently that you think are worth sharing?
Okay, well, it's a huge topic, of course, and we've
Yes.
been running a research project for about 5 years now, looking at a number of different countries, but 3 of them in depth in particular, in Indonesia, Peru, and Uganda. So we have findings of all sorts, from government, interviews with government and implementers, to communities, to kind of stakeholder workshops where people are looking at building scenarios around how to improve tenure security and things like this.
Mm-hmm.
And so I'm not really sure where to begin, but I mean, sort of one of the biggest finding is simply how difficult this is. That there's always, there are always challenges, there's always pushback. So if you manage to get tenure rights, it may be to an area that's much smaller than the original claim. Or sometimes we see in Peru, the title's handed over and then that's it. It's like there's no further understanding of any kind of a commitment, for example, from the government to help with conflict resolution or to prevent other people from invading your territory and things like that.
Yeah.
There's always, even this morning, people have been talking about some ways in which, even after rights are granted, the government will try to come in and take them away again because they found minerals, gold, one man spoke about this morning in India. So there's always this pushback, and sometimes I find myself talking about what to do to get the rights to work better, but there's just always this other aspect to it, which is the constant threat to the rights, constant attempts of other people to invade the rights, large corporations to gain access to the lands, pressure on the forest, all of these different issues that make it just this ongoing struggle. It's not only about getting your title and then being able to sort of move forward with self-determination in indigenous communities, but there always has to be this other angle of activism, really, networking, fighting back, being organized in order to protect what has been gained when you do get rights.
Wow. And are there any solutions? Do you see any, how this is going to change, or are we just going to have to keep struggling and fighting for this as part of the agenda of putting rights
Well,
on
one person said this morning that we seem to be saying the same things I've been saying for 30 years,
right.
And we don't really seem to be getting anywhere. And I think we have gotten somewhere. I mean, even just looking at the Rights and Resources Initiative's data on land titling and on land formalized for community use, there have definitely been improvements over time, with over 200 million hectares now recognized for indigenous communities, things like that. So we are, I think, moving forward, but it is a challenge. And I think that the role of government is really important. If the government is not on your side, and of course the government's multi-layered as well, right? You may have the support from a local government but not national, or from the national but not the local. So, but I think the role of government is key, pushing governments to generate or build political will based on helping them understand why this is important. But fundamentally, it really comes down to some challenging or looking for a new development paradigm on this planet.
Right.
Because the lands indigenous people hold have a lot of resources, they have a lot of forests, and it is still, these areas are still often seen by government, by development practitioners, and by investors as these places for other kinds of investments. So, lands that can be converted to something else that's more useful, and so on. And until we change the mindset, think about, what's the real global economic alternative to the way we live on this planet right now, these pressures are going to continue on indigenous peoples.
Oh, and that's very important. And so how can rights provide solutions to this climate crisis, for example?
So first of all, I want to emphasize the rights are really key.
Yes.
They're problematic. It's hard to get them. It's hard to get them the way perhaps they should be granted,
Right.
in terms of how, what is granted, the content of the rights, the duration of the rights, all of these questions, and whether they're protected or not once they are granted.
So if we get them.
So getting the rights
Yes.
is key.
Yep.
And then I think it's, so the connection to climate change has, there's a lot of evidence showing that indigenous peoples are better forest managers, land managers, and have more sustainable production systems, et cetera. Some of that is, the title itself may not be the reason for that, of course. It's because of community organization and what they've been doing and how they live on the land.
Right.
And they also are subject to pressures. So one of the things I'll talk about tomorrow, actually, will be some graphics on titled communities in one region of Peru, in Madre de Dios, which is a very strong mining region, where the mining communities, some of them have been able to resist the mining and some of them have not. And you can see the graphics in terms of the areas being deforested, tied to mining investments in their region. So again, being able to protect, to fight back, and to provide those same indigenous communities economic alternatives, because that's the other problem.
Right.
Indigenous peoples do sometimes support mining. They do get involved in mining themselves. This is a kind of an extreme case because it's a very polluted area, but it's because it's a huge economic opportunity.
Right.
So people have to have other opportunities as well, based on their own values and norms and goals, but those make a big difference. So in a couple of the communities, for example, one, you can see the curve where deforestation starts to rise. This is outside the mining areas.
Yeah.
You see deforestation starting to rise, and in one particular community, a rainforest company, I can't remember the exact name, came in and worked with the community to build up an ecotourism industry, and you see the decline in the deforestation rate, and it's now stable. In another, a community actually logged illegally for many years. Once they got their title, they started logging legally, but deforestation went up at first because of the logging roads being built, but then it did go back down and it stabilized, or it appears to have stabilized over time. So again, the importance of having economic alternatives for people's livelihoods.
Right, yeah. So for our last question, I know because you also, women's rights, in terms of women's voices, in this climate crisis, how important are they? And are they saying enough? Are women at the forefront, or is more needs to be done? What's your take on this?
Well, definitely, certainly thinking of the issues of rights, more needs to be done, not necessarily by the women themselves, but by the people who are trying to implement rights, for example, or I tend to talk about titling because I work in Latin America, and that's the main way in which rights are granted in indigenous communities.
Okay.
So in these areas, often they're gender blind, I guess, projects. Women are not necessarily involved in discussions about the area that should be demarcated. And we've seen in our own research, we did focus groups separately with men and women, and we also did interviews. All of our surveys were half men and half women.
Okay.
So we were able to get some really solid data. And of course, it's very varied within communities, but in general, women are not participating very much in demarcation and so on. They're not generally participating as much in communities around decision-making around forests, and yet they do use forest resources. We have produced some maps from the focus groups, and you can see that women are using different places than men use for different types of resources. And we found in some places, for example, that when men are in charge of the demarcation or making contracts for use of their land with outsiders, for example, they will sometimes contract out the areas that the women use, possibly because they didn't even realize it.
Oh, right. Okay.
So those are real concerns. We've been discussing over this week as well in different meetings around gender and women's involvement and how to improve that participation, what exactly needs to be done, and certainly the understanding of the challenges for women to even get to meetings based on the times of meetings and things like that is important. Understanding the power relations in communities that hold women back from either attending or being vocal once they're in meetings. And of course, the importance of them having rights to assets themselves, to land, to forest resources. And what we see in communal areas like indigenous communities is that women are subjected to the laws of the state, like all women nationally, and they're subjected to their household dynamics in terms of the equality of their household, how much of the burden of the household work is given to them, the inheritance rights, if their husband dies, who gets the land, is it going to be the wife or a son or a brother of the spouse, all of these issues, right? But in collective communities, you also have another layer, which is how the collective functions, and the rules of the collective, and the membership rules of the collective, and the norms and customs of that collective. So it's sort of an additional layer that women have to confront in terms of getting access to assets and asserting their voice and in communities. So one of the things that's happened, for example, in Peru, when communities become formalized, they have to formalize their community statutes as well.
Okay.
And in some cases, the women's organizations have helped women in the assemblies where they're writing the statutes to assure that women will have equal rights, either equal membership in the community, because sometimes the member only goes to the male household head.
Yes, yeah.
So equal membership, or in one community, for example, they changed the rules so that women could have access to land, whether or not she was married, whereas previously she had to be married first. So there are ways that things can happen, that a lot needs to happen.
Okay, but it looks like, it is changing from where we've come from. I know we're at crisis point, but I guess we have to start somewhere, or keep going and see hopefully how we're going to change things.
Yeah, we have a long way to go, and it's going to be a struggle.
An uphill one, yes.
Yes, I mean, I think another thing I wanted to mention is that we are in a climate crisis, right? It's a time of crisis. But one of the problems with the idea of crisis is that the sense of urgency sometimes allows organizations, perhaps international organizations, to sort of want to roll out big projects fast across the landscape, and that is likely to override or run over people's rights. So yes, we have an urgent problem, but we have to be able to invest in the grassroots, the deep-rooted understanding of what's happening at the grassroots, what people want, to listen and to work with people at the local level to make change happen that's going to be sustainable over the long term.
Right.
So we have a problem with urgency.
I hear you. Okay.
Can't always, perhaps can't ever really go broad, fast, and deep all at the same time. And I think we need to go deep.
Okay, I hear you. Great. Well, thank you so much for your time. Really appreciate you coming to chat with us. And I've learned a lot. Thank you, and have a great conference.
Okay.
So just sit here for a minute. Thank you.